Holy One, quiet our hearts and minds now that we may come to a quiet center where the distractions of life, our worries, our cares, do not pull us away from listening. Enable us to be centered in your love, that we may hear the word you have for us today. And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be pleasing to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. River crossings are dangerous places. A long time ago, when I was much younger and more foolhardy, I was taking part in an Outward Bound program, and we were backpacking in the Cascade Mountains of British Columbia. And we had to wade across the waters of the Ashnola River, which had a very wild and strong current. And I remember being terrified. Imagine water up to your knees, flowing so fast, 40 pounds on your back, knowing that one misstep and you'd be swept down the river, probably never to be seen again. River crossings are dangerous places. Think of all the myths and stories about river crossings. You know the story of the two monks who met a beautiful woman at a river crossing and had a big decision to make? Or the story of the frog at the river who was asked by the scorpion to carry it across the river? Or the ferryman across the river Styx to the underworld who demands payment? And of course there's the three billy goats gruff who meet a big ugly troll at the river crossing. River crossings are metaphors for times of transition in our lives, times when we have to deal with our fear of the unknown, with questions about ourselves, with dangerous choices, and in biblical stories, the possibility of an encounter with God that might change you forever. So when we read the story of Jacob at the ford of the river Jabbok, we know that this is not an ordinary story. In fact, this is a mythic story. It's not just about Jacob, it's about all humanity's struggles in the midst of change. It's a story about wrestling with ourselves and with God in times of transition. Now the text says only that it's a man who wrestles with Jacob. And it could be anyone. It could be his brother Esau. It could be the river god who guards the ford. And if, as we who have heard the story before, assume the wrestler is God, what kind of God is this? A God who will be wrestled to a draw by a human being? All night, in the mud and the reeds, in the water and out, Jacob and the man wrestle, and neither one can get the upper hand. So the stranger strikes Jacob on his hip socket and puts his hip out of joint. But still Jacob will not let the stranger go until he blesses him. And then we come to what I think is the heart of the story. What is your name? Asks the stranger. Jacob, he replies. And remember what the name Jacob means? Heel, liar, deceiver. In Jacob's name is everything he has ever done. In his name is the story of his whole life. His checkered past, his ill-gotten gains, his dodgy bargains, and his dubious marital and family relationships. And so by saying his name, Jacob is confessing who he is and what he has done. He's confronting all the things that are wounding him, the things that are limiting his life, the things that keep him afraid. But the stranger does not accept that Jacob, heel, liar, deceiver, is all that this man is. The stranger says to him, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, one who strives with God and humans and prevails." So now Jacob has a new name, a new identity, and a new future. And the one who has wrestled with him has not let him go without him knowing that he is known in his brokenness and in his possibility. Jacob, of course, wants to know this one who knows him, knows the good and the bad of him, the possibility and the failure. And he says to this one, "Tell me your name." And the stranger says, "Well, why do you want to know my name?" He doesn't tell it, but he blesses him. And Jacob understands that this is God who has been wrestling with him, God who has wounded him and changed him and blessed him. And now he can cross the river and limp into the morning, reminded by his aching hip of the God who has given him a new name, a new identity, a new future. And that future is already happening because Jacob and Esau embrace one another and cry in each other's arms. They're reconciled to each other as Jacob says to Esau, "Truly to see your face is like seeing the face of God." So maybe there's been a time in your life when you were at a crossing and you wrestled with God, refusing to give up until you received a blessing. Maybe it was a time like Jacob's, when you ended up confessing all the names that you have been called or called yourself, the names that haunted you and pursued you: failure, stupid, inadequate, unlovely, ugly, fat. The ideas we have about ourselves from things that happened in childhood. But you brought all of your brokenness and self-doubt to God and kept wrestling until God blessed you with a new name, Beloved. Or maybe you wrestled with God during a time of grief, calling out to God and questioning why this had happened, knowing that your life would never be the same and wondering how you could go on. But you brought all your pain and your sorrow to God and kept wrestling until God blessed you with a new name, Strengthened. Or maybe you wrestled with God after you retired or lost your job or all your children had left home or you got old. And you wondered who you were without those things that had defined you for so many years. Or maybe you even felt that your life had no purpose anymore. But you brought all your emptiness and confusion to God and kept wrestling. And God blessed you with a new name, Worthy. If we want to keep becoming whole our whole life long, we have to keep wrestling with God. Not only about who we are, but about everything that perplexes and vexes us in our own lives and in the world. The famine in South Sudan, global climate change, homegrown terrorists in this community. That was just a year ago, I remember. Or our own illness, or the illness of someone we love. Why children die, and some old people live on not even knowing their families. We have to wrestle with these questions in God's presence. And congregations, too, have to keep wrestling with God, especially during times of upheaval and change. And at Strathroy, I think you've gone through probably your quota of those things, we hope. And I hope you've kept wrestling with God through this time. As individuals, wrestling with God about what's my part in this congregation, in its brokenness, but also in its healing. How do I need to change so that the congregation can be more whole? What do I need to let go of or give so that the congregation can move forward? And as a congregation, you wrestle with God, asking, what's God's vision for us now? What new thing is possible now? How can we be reconciled with one another? How can we continue the mission and ministry of God in this place? In times of transition, we have to keep wrestling with God. For when we hold God close in that fierce embrace of our wrestling with questions, God is holding us close, wounding, changing, blessing us, so that we can discover the new name and the new life to which we are being called. So keep on wrestling with God. Trust yourself. Trust one another. Trust in Jesus, who walks with you, who could multiply the loaves and fishes into abundance for all. Trust him to create abundance in your life and in your congregation. And if you do, whatever the future holds, all things will be well. Thanks be to God. Amen.